Well, as we gather this evening and we continue our Lenten journey, this is a day in the life of the church which is called Laetare Sunday. So this is a Sunday where the priests put away their violet vestments and, of course, wear these beautiful rose vestments. So thankfully it's just twice a year I have to wear rose. But the Sunday gets its name from a Latin phrase which goes Laetare Jerusalem, which means be joyful, Jerusalem. And so this Sunday is the Be Joyful Sunday. And so we're joyful in one way because Lent is now almost over. It's now halfway over. So we just have 3 short weeks left until this great celebration of Easter, where Lent will then again be a distant memory. And so we are joyful because our journey is almost complete. Our great day of salvation is almost here. But we also rejoice and are joyful today because the gospel in itself is good news. In fact, the gospel is good news. That's what we call it, the gospel, the good news. And so it's good news because the blind now see, the sick are healed, the sinners are finally set free, even the dead are raised. If you remember back when Pope Francis was first elected, his first encyclical to the world was called The Joy of the Gospel, where he wanted to remind Christians that the gospel is joyful. So he had a really memorable line in there that got a lot of attention, where he encouraged Christians to not look like they were just coming from a funeral. So how many Christians do you know where they looked sad and downtrodden, maybe even in this season of Lent? They look like they're coming from a funeral. And that's not what our faith is about. Our faith is good news. It's the gospel. It's not bad news. And so we should appropriately rejoice. Well, an example of why we rejoice is that great long parable that we got to hear today, that famous parable of the prodigal son. And it's a long parable. I think that the church is trying to get us ready for Palm Sunday, where we have the longest of all gospels. So see this as a little exercise for getting you ready for Palm Sunday. But it's a parable that is incredibly rich and has influenced countless lives as people began to see the richness of this one parable. And it's a great source of consolation. It has been for a lot of people who have fallen away from God and have finally returned. And so if you haven't spent any time praying with this gospel, I really encourage you to use this coming week to do it, because it's so rich. There's so many things a priest could say, but we don't get too long up here, or people start to get angry at us. But when I hear this parable again today, I was thinking of the famous painting by Rembrandt. It's one of Rembrandt's most famous paintings. It was of this very parable today of the prodigal son. It's one of the last paintings he made. And if you know anything about the painting, it's overall a very dark painting. Reason being so that your attention is focused solely on this relationship of the father and his 2 sons, so there's no distractions. You're drawn into this relationship. And in the painting you see this prodigal son kneeling before his father, and he looks completely exhausted and weathered from a long journey. So his clothing is falling apart, it's barely on him, it's torn, has all these holes in it. He's missing one shoe, and the other shoe that he does have is falling apart and barely there. But yet, despite all of this, the father just embraces his son, despite what he sees, with a beautiful, loving compassion. And in the distance on the side, the older son looks in judgment as the father does this. But of all the things that really stand out in this painting, it's probably the hands of the father that really grab your attention. Because most of the painting does not have a lot of detail, but when you get to the hands are incredibly detailed. And those hands of the father, they rest on the back of that prodigal son, both welcoming and comforting that son after his long journey. We see those hands, they're not condemning the son for what he's done. They're not reprimanding him for the decisions they made. They just embrace the son. And the son in return looks like he's finally found the peace that he was looking for as he's embraced by the Father. So with this great parable of the prodigal son, this great painting to meditate on as well, Jesus was really trying to teach those pesky Pharisees and scribes why Jesus was spending so much time with sinners. And so it's a reminder of why we are joyful this Sunday, because Jesus does like to spend a lot of time with sinners. So there's hope for us that Jesus will spend a lot of time with us. And so we are joyful today because Jesus does indeed love to be with us. And although maybe at times we're like the prodigal son, or maybe we're like the older son, God is like the Father who truly embraces us with a tremendous amount of love. So no matter what we've done, where we've gone, whether we're the ones torn and falling apart, whether we're the ones who squandered our inheritance from heaven, God opens his arms to each and every one of us and welcomes us back, because that's what fathers do. And so as we hear this gospel today, maybe it was hitting home for you today. Maybe you reflected on how many times you were like that prodigal son who turned away from God and instead turned to the pleasures of the world as that prodigal son did, only to realize very quickly that the world could never satisfy your heart. Or maybe some of you are indeed like that older son today who just doesn't understand God's great mercy, how he could love even the greatest of all sinners. Well, this is indeed a great gospel for us to pray about in this year of mercy. So again, we're in this great year of mercy that Pope Francis has declared. And because this is a great gospel where we really clearly see what God's mercy looks like. So the theme of this year of mercy is called Merciful Like the Father. And yes, although at times we are maybe like the sons in our gospel today, God is merciful. And if we indeed are made in the image of likeness of God, as our faith teaches us, that we have to be merciful as well. So it's a time of year where a lot of people finally make it back to that sacrament of reconciliation. So I don't know how many hours confession I've heard already, but I know there's going to be a lot more ahead. But it's an exciting time of year where people finally get to let go of the baggage of sin, the burdens that come. The Church always asks us to go once a year at least, not because she wants to just impose a rule on us, another obligation, but because she's a mother and she knows what's good for us. Just like mothers always seem to know that broccoli is good for you. I don't know how that is, but somehow it's ingrained in mothers. And so this is our Mother Church saying this is good for you as well, to go to God's mercy at least once a year. And if you haven't gone in a long time, don't worry. It's good to come back. And all the priests I know are pretty kind. So don't be afraid to go to confession. And as a priest and as a confessor, one of the things that breaks my heart the most is not so much the sins that I hear, even if they're great sins, but rather what breaks my heart the most is those that don't come to confession who really could use it. So just think what would have happened if that prodigal son had never gone back to the Father. What would his life have looked like? How would he have ended his life? And so our gospel this Sunday really invites us to reflect both on how merciful we are as Christians. Are we truly forgiving and loving as our merciful Father? But are we also joyful? Because this gospel is incredibly good news that the world needs to hear. And so as we continue our final stretch, we're now into our final stretch of this Lenten journey. Today, let us indeed be joyful on this joyful Sunday, because God's mercy is so abundant. And indeed, the gospel is good news. It is a source of great joy.